It was my intention to discuss the features of the limbic system as it occurs in individuals so that we could all recognize it and discuss it together. But it's hard to discuss something if you don't also go into its expression, how it manifests in the real world and how we understand it as people, in each one of us. So I thought of my most obvious example and went to AI to get details. What I like about AI in this situation is that it has access to far more information than my memory would ever be able to access if I ever knew it. And as I was well aware that the best examples that could be used often come from the darkest part of the equation, that is, that feature in human personality, in human thinking, that makes us do things that are outside the norm and often are destructive of others. This is where I became reacquainted with the work of Bruce Jensen and James Mitchell, two psychologists who oversaw the torture of inmates at Guantanamo prison in Cuba. They were the developers of enhanced interrogation techniques that were used not only in Guantanamo but subsequently when the government in its infinite wisdom wanted to extract information from those who would not provide it on their own. Both of these psychologists, these men, were contractors for the CIA, as AI tells me, and their role was to train members of the military to withstand interrogation if they were captured. The name of the program was SERE, S-E-R-E, Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape. And as AI tells me, their new role was to reverse engineer this, extract information from inmates who did not willingly provide it, captors from what was believed to be a hostile force. I think it's funny to consider that even AI wasn't entirely open about what it was telling me about these two men and the processes they developed to extract information, because it first stated that the APA implemented policies that prohibited psychologists from participating in interrogations at any unlawful detention site. The humor in it for me was that I knew and had to ask AI, because of my memory, whether the American Psychological Association always condemned these practices. And only when asking did I learn what I previously knew, that in fact the American Psychological Association was the only professional agency that endorsed what they were doing, only later to retract it, and apparently successfully enough that even an AI search did not offer me this information up front, but I had to ask specifically about it, in response to which it provided me with a link to an article entitled Coalition for an Ethical Psychology, Background Statement on Annulment of the APA's PENS Report. And I will read directly from the introduction to this report. Over the decades since the horrendous attacks of 9/11, the world has been shocked by the specter of abusive interrogations and the torture of national security prisoners by agents of the United States government. While psychologists in the U.S. have made significant contributions to societal welfare on many fronts during this period, the profession tragically has also witnessed psychologists acting as planners, consultants, researchers, and overseers to these abusive interrogations at Guantanamo Bay Detention Center, Bagram Air Force Base, CIA black sites, and elsewhere. Moreover, in the guise of keeping interrogations, quote, safe, legal, ethical, and effective, close quote, psychologists were used to provide legal protection for otherwise illegal treatment of prisoners. The American Psychological Association, APA 2005 report of the Presidential Task Force on Psychological Ethics and National Security, known as the PENS report, is the defining document endorsing psychologists' engagement in detainee interrogations. Despite evidence that psychologists, including APA members, were involved in abusive interrogations, the PENS task force concluded that psychologists have a critical role to play in keeping interrogations, quote, safe, legal, ethical, and effective, close quote. With this stance, the APA, the largest association of psychologists worldwide, became the sole major professional healthcare organization supporting member involvement in the interrogation of detainees held under conditions that violate international law. Quote, as behavioral science consultants to interrogators, psychologists provided professional legitimacy and expertise to programs that have been condemned worldwide. Thus, the PENS report has contributed to significant harm to vulnerable populations by supporting policies that permit abusive treatment, has badly damaged the reputation of the profession of psychology, has diminished the APA's commitment to advance psychology as, quote, a means of promoting health education and human welfare, close quote, has compromised the integrity of the relationship between professional psychology and the security sector, and according to some senior interrogators and intelligence professionals, has undermined national security. It should be noted, and for those of us who remember, the most successful interrogators at Guantanamo Bay were the ones who established a rapport with the people who were imprisoned there. Over time, as trust was established, those people who refused to provide information would gradually provide that information to the very people who would work with them and treat them as human beings and with compassion. And so I asked AI whether these two psychologists had ever actually spent time interviewing people and treating people who were the survivors of torture. And the answer was no. It went so far as to list for me all of those things that these interviewers had not done. They had not consulted experts who treat torture victims. They had not reviewed clinical literature on trauma recovery, and they had not conducted any field research on this type of interrogation to see its effect. So what were they relying on? And that is the purpose of this particular discussion today. What I am suggesting is less about the effects of torture or whether it should be administered in order to extract information, but more about how people who have never actually researched the very thing that they are working on make decisions in an area that is highly sensitive without any knowledge base whatsoever. So what do we rely on, and how is it that these two psychologists would have no difficulty entering into a project that would not give them the results they wanted, except for paying them a substantial paycheck from the federal government? And my answer, in the broadest sense, is that it is the influence of the limbic system, which I also refer to as the snake or the lizard brain. And they had to say to themselves before they entered this project, what would influence me the most? And maybe they didn't even ask that question when they arrived at an answer that was an inaccurate one. Just torture them. If you torture me, I'll give you anything you want to know. And indeed, I'm sure they found that the most elaborate confabulators, and sometimes, probably oftentimes caught in contradiction, were people who were forced to reveal information that was non-information extracted by torture. But we each have limbic systems that operate in a very similar way. Not that it would end up with similar results, but that would also influence us under stress. I would suggest that there was an error in their thinking to begin with when they designed the program. That is, if they even took the time to imagine themselves being threatened with torture, in confinement, they might have thought instinctively that they would respond in fear and give up everything that the interrogator wanted. The fact of the matter is that that's not the situation they were walking into. In essence, they were walking into a situation where they had total control over the people that they were trying to extract information from, people who had absolutely no choice in where they were, how they were living, or what was being inflicted upon them. This isn't a product of simple fear. It's a product of what they are being driven to provide in terms of misinformation, which is actually what their interrogators got. It is really a product, if you will, of what the cerebral cortex, that is our conscious mind, tells us about the limbic system without directly consulting it as a source of information. And as I am arguing, the limbic system has its own source of information and its own reactions that are all part of who we are as human beings. So these psychologists might have thought they knew what they were going to get under certain circumstances that they created themselves, but they really wouldn't know because they're developing it from the cerebral cortex, that is the conscious mind, without really thinking about how their lizards would respond. But let us say that this is a bit of a symphony, that is an interaction between one level of consciousness and another. Unfortunately, in the case of these two psychologists, Mitchell and Jensen, they only thought they knew how a person would respond without ever having been in the situation themselves or ever having spoken to someone who survived such conditions. And I am arguing in a general sense, for successful psychology to take place, we have to consider both how we think about things, but also how we instinctively respond in certain situations. It is that disagreement that leads everyone who has difficulty psychologically to become hamstrung in unique conditions that have been unfamiliar to the point of experiencing it. I am somehow reminded of the television public servants announcements from decades ago, where you would see an egg and a frying pan, and the person holding the egg would crack it and simultaneously say, after dropping the egg in the pan, "This is your brain," and as it cooks, then stating, "This is your brain on drugs." Let's imagine this for a moment. I am holding an egg. I am cracking it on the edge of a pan. And I will tell you, "This is your brain," as it hits the pan. But then I will follow with, "This is your brain's limbic system." Similar to the effects of drugs, as the public service announcement would tell us, we really don't know the effects of the drug except that it ruins so many people's lives. And likewise, the limbic system, when unrecognized and influencing us consciously on an ongoing and daily basis, it can lead us into situations and circumstances that we don't know how to address because we might never have had to address them before. How do we think about these things? So I am arguing that the limbic system is actually learning even while the gray matter does, although it sometimes learns stuff that is entirely different than what the gray matter would tell us. As AI reminded me, the American Psychological Association initially covered for what the two psychologists were doing. And in fact, they wrote an entire ethical standard that was supposed to cover for their actions, permitting them to occur. And when things blew up, the APA, reacting the way any individual would, tried to cover for itself and then made it improper for this kind of conduct to occur. It's a kind of survival instinct, as AI was happy to point out. A survival instinct by an entire organization that has national and even international implications. So the American Psychological Association is not always ethical, despite its representations otherwise. And reflecting its lapses, it really puts emphasis on what the people involved can get away with, what the organization can get away with, and what they will do when they are caught. If this sounds like an organizational limbic system, you would be correct in my opinion. It was an organization moving to protect itself, despite the fact that it made decisions prior that were destructive not only of other people, but also of itself. And when an organization is under attack, how do they respond? Apparently no different from the way an individual responds under attack. That is, they retreat to the feral portion of their brain and fight back, or else completely concede and give up all the tools necessary for self-preservation. So did the American Psychological Association become wise as a result of this experience, that they suddenly changed their minds? Or did they instead find that social censure would be so severe as to impair the profession overall? And one might also wonder, did Mitchell and Jessen learn anything psychologically as a result of this experience? Or did they find another way to peddle their wares in another organization that would continue to reward them? I would argue that our training does not prepare us for any of this, nor did it prepare Mitchell and Jessen for the issues that would arise when ethical issues are thrown on the table in front of them, along with a pile of money to influence them to participate in something that everyone should have known would fail. That is, in more specific terms, if you put someone in a controlled environment over which you can subject them to abuse and torture, without giving them any means to avoid the abuse, they will behave much the way even prevertebrates will respond if under attack. They will find ways to hide, and if they don't have an environment to hide in, they will find ways to hide in themselves. They will retreat to the very part of the brain that is under attack, that is the limbic system. They will retreat into it, and anything they offer up cognitively will be to avoid further abuse. How much more of a natural response could there be other than to avoid further abuse and torture? How else do you respond by being kept awake 24 hours a day, by being bombarded with loud, abrasive music to keep you awake and under stress the entire time? The only option under these circumstances is to retreat into yourself, into the farthest recesses of yourself where no one can touch you, and from there you offer up what you must in order to have the torture reduced. Somehow, psychological training never taught Mitchell or Jessen this, and perhaps they never experienced it in their lives, but were simply rewarded for operating within a system that was abusive in the first place. I would imagine that under these conditions, the limbic system would be capable of even turning off the ears, that is, to diminish the sound of the acoustic bombardment that it was confronted with, in order to protect the person within, what most of us think of as the ego. There's a lot of stimuli that you can turn off if you're having to retreat within yourself. And indeed, it is the only way to survive, that is, if you want to survive at all. And indeed, if Jessen and Mitchell had that much curiosity, they could have approached Senator John McCain, who had been subjected to torture for years in Vietnam, having been captured. I would be surprised if he wouldn't have advised them against entering into this enterprise, having gone through it himself. But they never even went so far as to contact one of the most famous people to have survived intact after years of torture. And this might raise a further question. How much do we as human beings want to know, and how much don't we want to know? And for many of us, what we want to know is what will get us what we want, and the rest is irrelevant. But this, too, is a feral-like response from the limbic system that dictates our actions in specific situations. It's also the kind of thing that comes up in psychotherapy all the time. What do people want to know and what don't they want to know? And how can this kind of feral response be challenged and further adaptation be encouraged? And we now see this very mode of thinking being played out internationally in a way that is highly destructive of our way of life. I never read Trump's book on the art of the deal, but you can see in his actions today how he thinks about deal making and how he probably thought about it in the past. If you don't get what you want, the first thing you do is threaten and undermine and do everything you can to attack the person that is not giving you what you want. This does not lead to adaptation or to learning, but instead it will continue until it reaches the point where there is a threat that is leveled against, in this case, a country that doesn't like to be threatened, and many countries do not like to be threatened. But notice that the response from our president is to add additional threats on top of the ones previously delivered, as if suddenly an entire country will submit to his will. And when that doesn't work, he just adds to the threat, a condition that could tell us more about the functioning of the limbic system. That is, if our limbic desires to get certain things are not fulfilled, we just continue to pile it on, unless, of course, we begin to integrate how it is that we can solve a problem using not only the limbic system, but the cerebral cortex, and have them work in tandem to solve a problem, the solution of which may satisfy both parties if both from a feral point of view and a rational point of view, discussion can occur in all parties so that all conditions can be satisfied to arrive at agreeable terms for all parties involved. If the basis for the disagreement is what I want, but does not at all incorporate what you want, other than to reduce the abuse and coercion, there is no agreement that can be satisfactory, and the only way that it can be arrived at on mutually agreeable terms requires that, for those individuals involved, the limbic system's input as well as the rational cortex, and together the entire brain of all the parties involved can come to some sort of an agreement. I would say that you could look at this issue in political terms, or probably more accurately, you could look at it in terms of how everyone's brains function, including the participants in any negotiations, if they exist. And really, the answer is so simple. To encourage someone to do something that it is not instinctive for them to do otherwise is best accomplished by creating circumstances where they feel good about doing it. That is, where they don't feel like they're being screwed over, and they don't feel like it's a result of fear that you're instilling in them. This is something that our president apparently has never figured out. And for that matter, nor has the Iranian regime. They clearly can't instill fear in the country or the president of the country that is the strongest militarily in the world, and they will mow down all the people that live inside their borders who disagree with how the country is operated. But notice that even then, a large number of people within the country of Iran will not back down, even to the point where they are being mowed down by the military. From the limbic point of view, what this tells us is that you may be able to suppress resistance, but you can't make it go away. There is something in us that I would argue is a product of the limbic system that makes us resist even when we are watching our family and our friends being murdered all around us. This may be a conscious reasoned decision, but I would argue that it's also the product of something much deeper that impels us to engage in actions that might result in our own destruction, if in fact we are looking at a form of civilization that doesn't have any room for us in it. You could say that resistance is rational, and indeed it is, but I would say that it would have no force if it doesn't have also the influence of our instincts that impel us to take risks and engage in behaviors that might be threatening to our lives. Please take this as my first effort to reintegrate a part of our brains that are unrecognized in most, if not all, psychological research. And yet it is the part that we live with every day. Our intelligence is us, but so are our instincts that are ever present and that lead us to do things that the intellect might not want to do otherwise. It is my intention to further develop this line of reasoning in future in order to discuss how it affects us psychologically and where the psychological training may break down so that we may make better decisions even as psychologists, or for those who select psychological treatment as a preferred source of therapy. If these issues are important to you, I would encourage you to subscribe to this podcast and to leave any comments that would help pursue this subject further. Additionally, my novel, which I have described in the past about a forensic psychologist in a state hospital, addresses a very similar theme in fiction. And I am not against fiction in terms of explaining how psychology works. Rather, I encourage it. And if you prefer to learn through fiction, go to Amazon.com and look for Spiders Kill Their Young. That is my only novel that is posted, although there are some short stories there as well. And until then, be well, stay healthy, and for God's sake, don't go crazy.